Hello and welcome to this public meeting of the Economy and Place Policy and Scrutiny Committee. We are meeting in person, so thank you to officers and members for coming along. And I believe we have a public speaker who will come to in a minute, but just to go down the agenda, declarations of interest. Is there anything members have to declare? No, excellent. I think at this point too, we should deal with apologies. So I think we have received apologies from Councillor Waller and Councillor Widdowson. I think that's it. So we shall go to the minutes of the last meeting, which is to approve and sign. Are there any points on those minutes from February 2022? Not that I can see. No, very well. Well, in that case, we will approve and sign those as written. So we come to point 3, public participation. As I say, I believe we have one public participant, Jeff Beacon, who wishes to speak on agenda item 4, plans for carbon neutral and carbon zero.
Hello, can I be heard?
You can, Jeff. Very well, thank you.
Good, thank you. York's declaration of a climate emergency specifies the use of consumption emissions. Consumption emissions include air travel, food, and emissions from making the goods we consume, and some other things. These emissions have been sidelined in the draft climate change strategy using partial emissions data from the so-called scatter tool. But these sidelined emissions are drivers of climate change nonetheless, as others have noticed, bringing on climate catastrophe. There is another missing aspect in the strategy, the geographical distribution of emissions throughout York. Recently, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the UN, said, "To avert climate catastrophe, the main emitters must drastically cut emissions starting this year." In York, who are the main emitters? Those with the greatest consumption footprints. There is a website that can give a clue. It is carbon.place. It's not perfect, but it's the only attempt to break down emissions by small areas, and unlike the scatter data, tries to count all emissions. In York, it estimates that there are some areas where residents have carbon footprints that are several times others. Residents in parts of Bishopthorpe, Copmanthorpe, Strentsall, Woodthorpe have 5 times the carbon emissions of residents in some places in the York Centre. That is 5 times. To be serious, the climate strategy must follow Antonio Guterres and address these emissions soon, these missing emissions. A start would be education. I look forward to the councillors for these areas engaging with their voters and helping them understand the problems they create with their large emissions. There is also, of course, a role for planners, but I think first we must recognise the problem. There are areas with enormous carbon emissions within York. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Jeff. I'm sure all members will have noted your comments and will use them when discussing item 4. So we have no other public participants, so we shall move to item 4 on the agenda. Members will hopefully be aware, but for the benefit of the public, that Councillor Widdowson is unfortunately unable to join us today. And So because of that, obviously, we have some limitation, I think, on the discussion that we're going to have today. However, we do have a letter that has been circulated to members from Councillor Widdowson that hopefully outlines her thinking. I guess there are two ways forwards, and we could do a combination of these two, or just one of them. And I would say those two main routes are that we have a conversation now, we look through the document that we've been supplied with and submit any questions in writing. And I think the other one is to delay this agenda item until the executive member is able to attend. And I guess one solution might be that with officers that we've got in attendance and with this document, we could perhaps have a conversation now and then also invite the executive member back. But I open the floor to thoughts on how we should proceed. I saw Councillor Taylor first.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that the executive member can't attend today. It is one of the two aims really of scrutiny, isn't it? That scrutiny committees are there to hold the executive member to account. So it is unfortunate. I think we do need to be able to programme this in for a future meeting when the executive member is available. I think it will be possible though to have a discussion and ask some questions of the officers here today. It does strike me rather ironic that if we were holding this meeting over Zoom, then the executive member would have been able to attend and answer our questions, even though she's away in London.
Thank you for that. Councillor Douglas, and then I'll come to you, Councillor Daubney.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, I agree with Councillor Taylor that it's very disappointing that Councillor Widdowson isn't here, and it's not that just that she isn't here today, but we have requested now, I think 3 times, am I correct in that, and not managed to get her here?
I think that is correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. And of course, it's not just helpful to us for her to be here, but it is a legal requirement as well with her role as an executive member that she makes herself available for scrutiny. And that's not just by the committee, that's also by the public. And this is available to be viewed by the public, both live and in the future. And I think that given, one, we don't have or didn't have before the letter arrived a written report, and 2, she's not here, there is no way that the public can scrutinise any of this, any of the content. And I just would like to ask as well, has this letter been made available to the public?
It hasn't. I think perhaps that could be an action from this. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, I think Angela has stated we would have to seek Councillor Wilson's permission, but I'm, as the addressee of the letter, happy. So if she is happy, then I think, yeah.
Because even with our conversation, therefore, if it's not a public letter, I was going to suggest that perhaps we could read the letter out so that the public would have access to the information that's in there, but it seems like that won't be possible. So essentially we've got no information to share with the public, which I think is, I don't really know what to say. There's nothing here really in that respect. So I raise those issues and would be interested to know what other committee members think on them.
Yeah, I'll come to you, Councillor Daubney. Yeah, just to say that there is a line in here that says we're welcome to share with all members of the Scrutiny Committee for their information, but there is a full stop there. So I would be cautious about sharing it publicly without consent. Councillor Daubney.
Thank you, Chair. I think I can understand the need to ask Councillor Wilson's permission before sharing to the public, but provided that is forthcoming, I'm sure we can use this as a basis today for discussion on the topic, and ask for any clarification on questions which we are unable to receive clarity from the members, sorry, the officers. But I know that Tracy Carter is very expert on this topic, so it may well be that she can answer most of the questions, if not all, that we have to ask today. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, appreciated. Councillor Pearson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Obviously, it would always be good to be able to meet people in person and ask the questions directly. But I would like it noted that Councillor Widdowson is not here today because she's actually at a climate change conference in London, in many ways carrying out her executive role, learning best practice, etc., etc. I'm happy to share that with the public. You know, as a fellow Lib Dem, so I'm confident that her reasons for not attending tonight are valid and justifiable. So we've had a letter here. Obviously, I'm happy to discuss the contents of it. I think the executive member would be happy for it to be discussed this evening. What's been presented in the letter. Obviously, we will need to get her permission to share the letter. We could note it with the agenda papers. And we've got officers here tonight who are heavily involved with the project, who we can ask questions of. And I feel entirely comfortable that we can carry out scrutiny with or without the executive members.
Thank you for that. I will bring you in a minute, Councillor Douglas. I wasn't going to comment on this in this way, but I have discussed this with scrutiny chairs and vice chairs previously. All of us have raised our concerns. It is essential for the legal functioning of this council that the executive member is scrutinised fully, and that means attending these meetings. I acknowledge that there are very important conferences, etc., that the executive member must attend. And we're very happy to work with her to sort dates, as we have tried to do in the past, but it is essential. And these meetings are not minor things. They're not things that can simply just be skipped on the regular. They are a crucial part of her job, and she is expected to attend them. And I've made that very clear as chair. And I know I would be supported by chairs of other scrutiny committees in saying that. And I just wanted to make that clear, that whatever we do going forwards from this, it is really important that we have the executive member for the environment and climate change along as soon as possible, because it has been too long since we have scrutinised her and her role. Councillor Douglas.
Yeah, and I'd just like to raise the point that I understand that it's not just that these meetings have been set up on dates that are random, and therefore the executive member may have other appointments on those days, that these further meetings have been set up to accommodate her diary to try and get her here. And we still don't have her here after, I think it's 4 months. So I'm sorry, I don't really have much sympathy.
I would perhaps suggest we move on to discussing the meat of this. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Just to respond to Ed, I'm not suggesting that what the executive member is doing in London is not important, but I do think that missing several subsequent several previous meetings does make it start to look unfortunate. And having chaired scrutiny committees for some years, executive members have always appeared before the committee, some with more reluctance than others, I have to say, but it is a requirement. So I do think we need to put that in the diary and liaise with the executive member and get her agreement to attend in a future meeting. Now, one of the questions that I would have liked to have asked her, and we can put this as a question in writing perhaps, and maybe the officers would like to chip in, is bearing in mind that York City Council, the City of York Council is only really responsible for about 4% of carbon emissions. In order for York to become sustainable and net zero, to achieve that ambition, the other 96% are going to have to come from elsewhere, the general public, business, etc., etc. And what is her plan to engage with the public and to engage with business and our partners to achieve that? I'm very happy to hear what the officers have to say, but I would like an answer from the exec member. And I think it's something that we all have to seek to address as time goes on, because time is going on and this is an important issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that touches well on Jeff's point from earlier as well, joins up well. Tracy, do you want to come in on that?
Well, clearly I can't speculate on the Councillor Widdowson's intentions for engagement on the broader climate change area. Firstly, I'm an officer, not a member, and secondly, I'm not actually the one responsible for the kind of climate change agenda. So my input to today's meeting, I can talk with some authority, if not expertise, around how we take York Central forward. But I'm not really able to respond to the broader climate change scrutiny issues that you just referred to there. So, but happy to take questions about where we are now on York Central, how we've got there, and how we take this agenda forward with regard to the development out of an area of the city, which is, it is a significant issue because it's a third of the size of the city centre. Read it interestingly, the comments of the public speaker were largely around the suburban areas of York and the kind of car centricity of those areas. I think adds to that carbon footprint. We've got a real opportunity with York Centre because of its location around public transport to make sure that we bake in the low carbon lifestyle as well as the kind of construction elements of it. But happy to take questions on York Central.
I would perhaps suggest, and I don't know what members think, but are you happy talking briefly about that in the general before we go on to questions? Because that seems to me a better way of focusing our minds and getting on what we're talking about, and not making sure we're not asking you questions that you're not comfortable responding to, perhaps. Is that a way forward you'd be happy with?
Certainly. And in terms of the question that Councillor Taylor asked, about, sorry, was it you or was it Claire that asked a question about engagement? I can talk about engagement in York Central as well, but not about the broader climate change agenda. So it's one of those kind of weeks where you're kind of totting up how long you've been doing things. We're about to we're taking possession of the Guildhall. Been working on that for 10 years. We got a big decision last week at Executive around releasing the enterprise zone money for York Central. Been working on that one for 10 years, and I think it's important that we put that in the context, because the way in which we've shaped our approach to York Central has got quite a lot of the backstory to it. It's not just something that is entirely current, and the process of putting together a collective ambition for the site, developing out the master plan, undertaking the consultation, all the detailed work on putting the funding proposal together and getting a planning permission to get the site ready for development have taken all of that time. That's been against the grain of some quite significant challenges to do all that. And if we've been having this conversation 6 years ago, 5 years ago, even 4 years ago, just getting it done would have been an absolutely huge achievement. As with these things, you pick the low-hanging fruit, and then you're asked to climb up the tree and get the out-of-reach apples at the very top. The climate change agenda, although it's not even invented in the last 5 years, but the commitment from the council to address the climate change issue and to commit to becoming zero carbon by 2030 came a long way down the line of the York Central planning process. The standards that are embedded within the outline planning application for the site, which again, to be clear, it gives the parameters, it gives the context, it gives some of the quality standards. It doesn't define what's going to get built on there. That's all still to play for. But it does bake in some minimum standards, and those have been baked in above the levels set in our own planning policies or in the national planning policy frameworks. So, for instance, on the commercial spaces, we have built into the design guide and the outline plan application that commercial spaces must be built to BREEAM excellent standards. That's not zero carbon, but it is low carbon, and it's low carbon in use. Our work that we are undertaking on developing ideas for a housing delivery programme scheme, council developed housing on the site, is zero carbon in use. That's passive house standard. It is likely that the first pieces of the site to be developed out beyond the infrastructure are going to be the first phase of commercial and hopefully a first phase of residential. We really want to be leading on that first phase of residential using our own land and are in communication now with the main landowners to see whether that is something that they will support us on to deliver passive house housing as the first phase of residential. If you were listening into the executive meeting from last week, the landowners are in a early stages of a negotiation around an anchor tenant who for a large scale commercial first phase delivery. I've now upped the ante in the ask of the landowners to say to them once again, what are we doing about zero carbon on York Central? It's not a given yet, it's not landed, but there is still significant room for influence. And I think that's where the input from the Scrutiny Committee will be really useful to be able to feed into that debate. We've undertaken some work on the site around local energy generation. So we had a study undertaken, funded by West Yorkshire Combined Authority, I think about 4 years ago, to look at the feasibility and viability of a district heating system on York Central. It looked at it in the context of other areas of the city where a broader network might actually become commercially viable. The study was a little inconclusive in that the relationship to other areas such as the hospital became impossible because they'd already built out their district heating system for at least 3/4 of their estate. Thank you very much. So it ended up being a York Central specific district heating solution, which at that point was not commercially viable. And I think that we also had questions about the technical desirability of it because there isn't a natural source of heat to harness for the district heat network. You would have to generate the heat, and that would probably at this point have meant burning fossil fuels on site to be able to deliver a district heating network. And in my naivety, I didn't think that was a great idea. Having discussed it once again with Sean Gibbons, our climate change lead at officer level, he's still making the argument that it significantly reduces carbon from a whole series of gas turbines running commercial operations, and that we need to look at that study again to see whether or not either the technology has moved on in that time or whether it's still an attractive thing for us to wish to do. And his other point is, and I think this kind of chimes slightly with one of the points that Councillor Widdowson makes in her letter, is that the journey towards decarbonisation isn't a fixed point in time, and you need to be able to build in opportunities for you to easily decarbonise as technologies evolve. So if you've got one district heat network that serves the whole of York Central, then it's easy to decarbonise that once rather than having to replace every single heating solution in every single building. So I think there's still some way to go on looking at whether or not that is technically desirable and financially viable. The other aspect of the carbon footprint from York Central is around transport. It's around it's utilising its position both in proximity to the railway network, but also to public transport bus interchange networks. It sits at the very heart of our transport infrastructure for the city. There is no place better placed to be low or no car. And although in order to open up the site up for development, we have had to put in a highway, that's all that's required to enable the site to deliver. We're not putting in more highway than we need. And the Highways Authority will also have decisions to take in the coming years about whether or not to allow through traffic and how to control traffic on the site. The site also has a large amount of pedestrian and cycle provision built in, either across the site or linking into neighbouring communities and neighbouring areas. So the links in to cycle pathways coming down over Water End, over onto Holgate Road, over a new bridge over the freight avoiding lines to come down Wilton Rise, or links through the station onto the new Scarborough Bridge, which connects that way, and then improved cycle and pedestrian facilities going through the Leland Road tunnel. It will be an area that's built with the dominance of pedestrian and cyclists at its very heart, rather than cars. But it's I think we're creating a new place, but the places take time to evolve, even if you're building them from new. And we need to be mindful of changes that will happen in the coming 5 to 10 years. The ambition for zero carbon amongst our partners, I think, has also been clarified for us with recent changes at the top of the organisation. They've got a new chief executive and a new chairman of Homes England. They have got they've got a real commitment to considering zero carbon in the things that they do, and are really interested, for instance, in what we're doing in our housing delivery programme to try and increase the level of affordable housing, but also to make that zero carbon. So I think we've got some willing participants in that debate. The question of financial viability is always going to be one that comes round. My argument would be that there is £155 million of taxpayers' money going into putting the enabling infrastructure into that site, and we therefore need to be able to deliver on other public objectives. And zero carbon has, over the last 4 or 5 years, become one of those top ones, and that's where I'm now starting to kind of turn the heat up on that discussion with landowning partners, with a view to making presentations to the strategic board and to the landowning board on where we want to set the bar. So at that point, I could be opening up for any questions, but also to hear your comments on what your ambitions are for York Central and how you think that might be achieved.
Thank you very much for that, Tracy. That's very helpful. I shall open up to hands. I see Councillor Daubney.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tracy, for that explanation of the challenges of York Central. My understanding is the project is in fact very long term. It's about 20 years in development in terms of its.
Depends how big the first bit is, but we've always talked about 15 to 20 years in development. If you make a big splash in the first, then it might be slightly quicker.
But of course, some of the technologies which enable zero carbon to become reality are still in development, and they will come forward as the project advances. So I suspect it's going to be a lot easier to achieve some of these ambitions as the years go by than it is standing at year zero.
Thank you. I think that's a fair point and a good observation.
Even since we did that first study on district heating, the prevalence of air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps, it's a radically different world, and that is changing really, really fast. The technologies are developing at a great rate. So, in some of the larger housing schemes of regeneration projects we've put in air source heat pumps in a way that would not have been possible 5 or 6 years ago to be reliable sources of heat.
Councillor Taylor, and then I'll.
Firstly, thank you, Tracy, that this project is actually getting going. after so many years. I think some of us might have died before this project got off the ground. We might have been considering that over the last 30 years or something. Secondly, I know there has been a great deal of resistance to car-free developments at York Central. And I think that the amounts of traffic which it will generate will be problematic to the surrounding areas as well, surrounding residential areas, because it is a big development. But we are where we are, I suppose. Thirdly, of course, technological developments occur all the time, and sometimes they seem to be, as we get older, it seems to be increasing with greater pace. But of course, it is also easier to install heating technology at the early stages rather than retrofit something at a later point. So I think that argument of saying, it's easy to, it may be better to do it in the future is not necessarily the case, because it's easier to bring it in as the site is being developed. And the final point I wanted to make was about the commercial building, and that sounds an exciting prospect. And as well as our ambition for it to be zero carbon, I think we should also have an ambition for it to be interesting architecturally. So I'll just throw in my comments about that as well. We have managed to achieve this with some buildings in York in recent years. Many of them have been pretty poor. But for instance, Hiscox building is exceptional in terms of modern architecture for this city. So it can be done. Thank you.
I share your ambition. I think the first buildings that go on York Central are really going to set out our stall, and they've got to be a fitting match for the beauty of the rest of the city. Now, modern architecture is a divisive subject. Not very rarely get everybody to agree on whether a modern building is attractive or not. But that is certainly what we will be encouraging for those very first buildings. I think you might have misinterpreted what I said. I wasn't really saying technology will develop and it's all right, we'll do it later. There are some things that you've got. There are some things where you need to think about first principles. So fabric first, consideration of insulation and materials is absolutely fundamental. And that is not difficult to achieve. You just need to start from that first principle. I think it's the mechanical and engineering solutions that are evolving at a greater rate, and that we may see some improvement and change on those. But it's absolutely possible to do that with air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, water source heat pumps. We're just fitting the pump on the Guildhall today to make that work. If you can heat the Guildhall with green technology, then there's hope for the rest of it.
Absolutely.
I just forgot to mention that the National Railway Museum 50-60 million pound refit that they're undertaking, the first phase of that is for their central hall. There's a planning application due to come to committee in the near future, and they've built into that air source heat pump heating and photovoltaic cells. So those principles are starting to be seen on the first buildings that are likely to go through, and that actually will be the very first new build, and needs to therefore kind of walk the talk on our eco standards.
Love a bold building. Excellent. Councillor Pearce.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I was just there's lots of things I'd like to mention really, but obviously I work for my day job for the rail operator that runs the station, and part of the York Central project is to create that new station entrance, because at the moment when you leave the station from that side of on the York Central side, you've essentially got a set of weaving steps that were built just before the accessibility laws changed on the cheap to create a sort of back road to the railway museum. And I really think we could make a feature of that station entrance, because it's actually going to be something where you arrive into York as a resident or a visitor, and that will be your main way into York.
It was for Railfest in 2004.
Yes, yeah. That's right, yeah. And so, yeah, I think one of the things I'd really like is that feeling of great public realm, having the trees. One of the things you notice if you ever climb to the top of the Minster, or I've yet to do it, but to go up to Clifford's Tower with its new roof, you notice how green York is, and I'd really like to think that York Central would continue that theme. And it certainly the plans as they stand seem to have lots of green space and lots of greenery. So I really hope that comes to fruition. But I just wondered if you might know more about the sort of public realm side. I suppose a second question, if I may, Chair, is around transport modelling and whether any analysis has been done around what the impacts of becoming car-free in York Central would be, and what that would mean for all the other streets. Because if we close York Central to traffic, what would that necessarily mean for other routes into city? Would they become more congested? Would the air pollution increase? There really is a balancing act. I can certainly see arguments for going car-free, but it really does need to be looked at really thoroughly. And so I'd like to know, I guess, what analysis has been done on that side of things.
Okay, so I'll take the first question first. Then I think you're right. The station is really primary importance. How it interfaces not just into the station but to the rest of the city. It's the gateway to the site, and using an imaginative station entrance to improve the accessibility of the whole station, I think is also important. But it can't just be a kind of little gate with a Network Rail sign or a Great British Railway sign over the edge of it. It's got to be fairly emblematic, and that will then open up into Station Square and to Museum Square, which are the two biggest bits of hard public realm. How the NRM sits within that Museum Square, how it relates to the commercial space, all of great interest to the incoming tenant, because the positioning of that commercial space is really critical to them. And I therefore do expect that we'll have some, good quality, well thought through, well consulted on designs for those public spaces. You'll know that from the outline plan application at the moment, there's some indicative ideas of where they are and what they look like, but those are not the worked up designs. And there's quite a lot of what's go under the bridge on public consultation, design work, public consultation, and overcoming some of the tricky, boring things like topology and the fact it's not all flat. So that's to come. There's a really important piece of new green space that we'll be building, the largest park the city's had for several hundred years, probably, I think, since Roundtree Park was opened. We've not had a space as big as this. It's an opportunity to have a bit a space that is not only a great place for people to go into, but also it's doing its work as the lungs of York Central. So the need to build in biodiversity as well as more formal aspects to that public space, really important. And it then feeds into, at the top end of the site, the Millennium Green, which was an area at the turn of the millennia when we created a piece of natural habitat. It's in a bit of a state at the moment. It's going to get a complete makeover and a facelift. But I think how that piece then joins on to the end of the park, it will be really important to get public engaged in that, because that's the bit where we can put back without too much difficulty, isn't it? On the issue of transport modelling, when we were doing the outline planning application, there was an intensive period of transport modelling, of modelling different accesses onto the site. What would happen if you had through traffic? What would happen if you had not through traffic? And the high level findings of that were that if you didn't allow traffic to come through the site, you would be closing off what is currently one access route through into the city for the residents of that area now. We'd be causing them a lot of disadvantage, but you would also create traffic problems out onto Bootham, Holgate Road, Poppleton Road, Blossom Street, the impact cascaded right up to the A64 in terms of traffic numbers, which is why the application was made for it to be with through traffic. The expectation that it is low car it will be built into many aspects, both through the provision of alternative ways of getting about and how you then can control parking on the site and how you encourage people to behave and operate when they're on the site. I don't think that we have, again, not my area of expertise, and I'll be contradicted by Tony if he were here. I don't think we've modelled a car-free area because in order to get the viability figures to be able to open it up, there's always been an assumption that that required a highway into the site to make it commercially viable. There are very few precedents of doing an area of this extent. Let's not forget it's a mile long without having a highway. It has got roads through it. However, that doesn't stop the ambition of trying to drive for it. But you can't look at York Central in isolation from the rest of York. It isn't. It's not insulated from the rest of it. And we know from looking at city centre issues that as soon as you change one thing, the impacts cascade onto another. So if you want to do car free, you're going to have to look at the whole city. There's no easy way of just saying, well, we'll do car free on York Central, and that will tick the box. It's not going to work. You've got to look at what happens, where you displace traffic from and to, and what the impact that has on our existing communities. So piece of work I think that's one to be considered as we think about that challenge for our city. And you know, we've had a big piece of work on it this year. It will continue to be something that we've got to work on and try to improve. Local transport plan is the next time we look at that, the strategic challenges for our transport network, and that's an appropriate time to look at that issue of York Central in the context of the rest of our highways network.
Thank you. Just for the benefit of the public, I think at some point Councillor Taylor interjected with King's Cross as a suggestion for somewhere without roads, and Tracy has remarked that there are existing roads that run through that site, just because I don't think that was on mic. Councillor Douglas.
Thanks, Chair. And yeah, on the transport element, I think this is really important, and I'm also aware that this isn't Tracy's area of expertise nor her day job.
I don't have any today.
And she's done a remarkable job of filling in for the executive member and who should have been here to tell us about these things. But I think that the transport element is tremendously important. You know, buildings, we've kind of got or are beginning to get a handle on that and know what we should be doing around that. In the city, it's 61% of carbon emissions. The next largest contributor is transport, that I believe is around 30% of our emissions. And the Highways Authority will have decisions to make, as Tracy said, but I don't think we are clear at all what the Highway Authority, the decisions that they are going to make about Lehman Road and the access through the tunnel. I know as a council, we haven't spoken at all about a car-free site. What we've spoken about is to minimise non-essential journeys, because we understand that not everybody can get around without a vehicle, and that would include people with disabilities, also deliveries. There are essential elements that need to come into the site, but the Highways Authority is going to have a tremendously important role in this, and I think we need to flesh that out more and make reasonable and well-informed decisions around that. And the transport plan, the local transport plan 4, is tremendously important. And my understanding at this point is that we're not really still looking at a holistic approach across the city. And until we do that, I don't think we are going to get a suitable and a low car environment on York Central. And I think it would be a huge opportunity missed. I think it's vitally important we look at the whole city. And until we do, we're just not going to solve this problem.
Thank you. Tracy, do you want to come back on that, or are you
Well, it is
More of a
the
comment.
purpose of LTP4 to look at the holistic evolution of our existing network and how new pieces of highway infrastructure interface with it, including the outer ring road. You know, some pretty big changes that are already agreed and coming about, and how we amend and adapt the remaining highways infrastructure to respond to that, and the public transport network is an important one. Let's not also forget that we are, you know, we're early stages on the adoption of the electrification of our vehicular fleets. That will happen over the next 10 to 15 years. So the existence of cars on our roads has a different impact if they are electric cars rather than petrol or diesel.
Although, as I think has been noted in this committee before, they still have significant polluting impacts in the air quality and stuff because of braking and things like that. Councillor.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Mine's sort of linked to that as well. Oh, sorry. Coming from Poppleton, obviously, that route is the way that most people go because the A59 is quite congested and there's some really tricky narrow bits just past the descent into Water End. So everyone, my area, is a bit upset about the prospect that the road might be shut. But the thing is, in Poppleton, you did have the joy of a railway line that would get you to the railway station, and I often use that. But now we've heard that that service is going to be drastically cut, which means we're going to be forced into our cars as well. Added to that, you've got all the villages beyond the ring road that have very little bus service and none at night, and they're forced to use their cars. And it's just that frustration that people want to be green, they want to use public transport, but they just don't have an option. You know, it's just really sad. So that's just a general comment, really.
You're definitely outstripping my professional expertise here now. But,
yeah, but I just wanted to register it.
I think just to kind of note that the railway industry as a whole are really struggling with restoring their numbers. Leisure use of railways has increased.
But it would help if they actually issued timetables and had the screens in the station working, which haven't been working
way
since.
above my pay grade, that one.
You know, that's a comment as well.
You should speak to your rail provider, really. Councillor Hunter.
I think it's just coming back down to we need to educate people. And, you know, we've all got so complacent that we've just got our cars and we just do it for short journeys, you know, even taking our children to school. And I think we just really, if we're emphasising that York Central is wanting to be sort of car free, then we need to even bring it into our schools to get our kids to go back onto bikes and to walk and sort of look at more of a health facility that, you know, rather than always just thinking you just jump in your car. And I think it all just comes back down to re-educating our mindset, really.
One way, the carrot and stick side, yes, the carrot of making it more easier and more attractive to use a bike or to walk than it is to get in the car. And although there will be a highway running through York Central, there won't be loads of places to stop or park. And the residential areas that will be built won't have a kind of network of through roads. It will be residential only. So there's ways in which you can develop that strategy so that it discourages people. It makes cars an inefficient way to get to town or through that route. And then, well, the whole zero carbon journey, we've all got to go on a journey, haven't we? We all live in houses that have got to be retrofitted, unless you're lucky enough to live in one of our passive houses that we're building now. We've all got personal choices about our investment and of money and time and energy. And it's not something that the council's going to wave a wand at and solve. It's for all of our communities. So it kind of comes back to your point about how are we communicating and engaging with our residents about their personal journeys towards zero carbon.
I think it's a really important, these behaviours, isn't it, as a key element. I was going to make a comment. I am aware in passing of some issues that we've had in my part of the world, just over the border in Derwentthorpe, where the new estate was built with very bold aspirations of carbon neutrality, and yet there are streets that were built with very little parking to discourage parking, and everyone has a car, and the streets are absolutely rammed with parked cars, and the surrounding streets have issues as well. And I think part of the challenge, and I don't know what the answer is, but part of the challenge to that built infrastructure thing is, how do you build an infrastructure that not only encourages behaviours that are positive for this sort of stuff, but also doesn't allow for behaviours that aren't positive? How do you stop sort of neighbouring streets becoming car parks, or people parking in things that aren't parking bays in the estate, if you're solely relying on few parking bays to sort of reduce the numbers of cars, if that makes any sense? Yeah, kind of more of a general thing to think about rather than perhaps a specific. Councillor Taylor.
I'll ask a different question. We'll try and get away from transport for a bit. This country builds some of the smallest houses, new houses, certainly in Europe. And yet we're also in a period where more people are working from home. The pandemic has brought home working forward. It was already starting to happen, but the pandemic has brought that forward, and we've all experienced working from home. Is there going to be an effort to make sure that homes are big enough to accommodate home office, and that we're not going to have a lot of tiny little chicken coops that are not big enough for families?
Three aspects to that. Firstly, small houses are easier to heat, greener. Small spaces are not always bad. Although I think lockdown is not something anybody expected when we were doing the design guide for York Central, but the standards, the space standards set out in the design guide, which will be used to determine future planning applications for residential spaces, are to meet the national space standards, which are larger than some of the volume house builder units that have been built over the last few years. Good residential development thinks about space in slightly different ways. So the developments that we ourselves are building on Lowfields, on Dunker Barracks and Burnham are all the space layouts. It's not just about the amount of space, but it's the allocation and use of space and the flexibility that you've got. So they've all got the potential for a spare room to be used as an office, and to think about where that's located. Personally think that the economy has changed, and no matter what Jacob Rees-Mogg says to the civil service, we're all working from home a lot more than we will be, and that will last going forward. So I don't think it's going to go back. York has a really great advantage of being one of the best places in Britain to work from home. It's got everything it needs, but working from your office, from your house, is not always the most desirable option either. So thinking through community spaces as to how they might be used for that kind of, the kind of the coffee shop option, or the fixed workspaces, thinking about how the commercial spaces might interface with the residential to provide that kind of drop-down model for people, so that it's not just, I'm at home, oh, there's my bed, oh, there's my desk. You've got an option. So I think all those things are to be played out in future planning as the residential schemes come forward.
Thank you very much for that. I think we should move on to the next agenda item, but a massive thank you to you, Tracy, for that presentation out of nowhere, and the answers to those questions, and thank you to members for that debate, which I hope was useful and helpful. So we will move to agenda item 5, which is the Q3 Finance Monitor, which you'll find on pages 9 to 28. I don't know if you want to speak to this beforehand, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So the report presented to the committee covers the third Monitor Finance and Performance Report for services that report into the Scrutiny Committee. It summarises data that was considered by the Executive back on 7th of February this year. It's worth reminding members that the forecasts that were put together for this particular report were undertaken in December. It has been a very difficult year in terms of forecasting. The first quarter, we were still very much in lockdown. The second quarter, we're seeing people coming back into the city. The recovery was going well. We got to December and Omicron was all the rage in the news. So how we were then forecasting what was happening for the rest of the year has been challenging. This is particularly relevant with the budgets that are in economy in place. Very significant income. If you look at the budget for the directorate, it's about 60 million of expenditure and 39 million pounds worth of income, and the income is coming from key areas such as car parking. Sorry, no, we've been talking about that previously, but we do rely quite heavily on significant car parking. There's income coming through from commercial waste, which is very dependent on the economy and so on and so forth. Our commercial portfolio, very dependent on successful both retail and commercial activity going on within the city. So at the time of the report, we were forecasting an underspend of £341,000, which was an improvement on where we were in quarter two. The areas where we have seen improvements, car parking has been very successful. We appreciate that there's been public transport hasn't recovered to the level that people were comfortable using the car, particularly in those early months. The revenues from car parking from July through to December were 20% above budget. Every month in that period saw the highest month that the council had earned income compared to any previous year. So July 21 was higher than any previous year of July. December 21 was the most money we've ever taken from car parks, over £750,000 from one month, which we've not seen numbers like that previously. So that's had a significant benefit to the directorate. I think it's fair to say also it's likely to be a one-off impact. It's not likely to continue at those sorts of levels. I think as the tourist economy picks up, people will be looking to go abroad. They'll probably have less money for city breaks within city. We'll wait and see on that one. The other one area where there was a significant spend is asset and property management, and that is very much a one-off. And it links into York Central. We bought a building, Alliance House, about 4 or 5 years ago when the access was considered for York Central might be going through Holgate Road. We bought it from Network Rail for £1. We've owned the asset for 4 or 5 years. We've sold it for a similar amount of money that we bought it for, but they have reimbursed us all the business rates that we paid over the period of time that we owned the site. So we've had a windfall income this year, which has paid for the business rates from previous years. I think that's the kind of the main issues I'd want to say on the finances. In terms of the performance data, that's shown in Annex 1 around the themes that the scrutiny look at, so economy, getting around sustainably, green and cleaner city. We're more than happy to answer what questions you may have based on our knowledge, but I'm sure you'll appreciate myself and Tracy around the room. We're not transport experts, we're not necessarily waste experts, but we will attempt to answer what we can, and if we can't, we will pass them on to officers who will be in a better position to answer.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I see a lot of hands going up. Councillor Taylor, I think you were first.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. I accept everything you're saying about car parking and tourism changes. I think those estimates are very applicable. How are you on trees? I have a question on the greener, cleaner city section on page 17. On the number of trees planted. Now it says that the data for this is going to be available in April, and we are approaching the end of April. So I'm assuming the data might have appeared. But that line about the number of trees planted suggests the direction of travel is level, but the figures seem to be going down dramatically, and we haven't currently got the latest data. So do we have the latest data? Has it gone up dramatically or what?
I don't have the latest data, but what I do know is that following the purchase of the site near Rufford, we have been planting the first, I'll try and find the right word for it, batch, the first phase of
Cops.
the first phase of trees on that particular site. So the numbers will be significantly higher than what's reported in this particular report.
Yeah.
It's not a linear thing, is it? It really comes and goes.
I think we also, at the last meeting, Sean raised the point that he'd just commenced a city tree giveaway, or whatever it was called, where there were another 500 trees were being developed. So I think some of those early plans that Sean has put in place are now starting to bear fruit and come to leaf.
Thank you, Tracy. Councillor Hook, I think I saw you next.
Yes.
Can you remember to put your, thank you.
Sorry, I'm not used to being in person, that's the trouble. Yes, given that it is nearly April, do you have a feeling as to how the finances will be? Is that a pretty good forecast for the fourth quarter, or do you think things will have changed now that?
Well, obviously, what we report through to scrutiny is information that we pass through to the executive,
right.
so we haven't been in a position to update the executive. We're currently working through the figures. It's fair to say that things, particularly in this directorate, are better than what we reported in Monster 3, but I can't go any further than that at this point.
Just as a note that the kind of being better, as in spending less, there is a real trend across all directorates, and place is no different. Difficulty of recruiting staff, it's not just us, it's a national issue. Some of the savings that we've got here will be because of vacancies that we're carrying because of the difficulty of recruiting staff, which then has a direct impact on performance. So it's not all, it's not all green lights. And
the other point I would add to that is the report that went to executive in 7th of February was reporting a council overspend of over £4 million. So there are significant pressures across primarily the people directorate, both in looked after children, adult social care. So the message across certainly the place directorate has been to minimise spend and to assist the overall council in coming in within budget. So it was always been the intention that we would be coming in better than the position that we reported in February.
Thank you for that. Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wondered on page 15, I think it is, getting around sustainably, the table there. It's discussed to some extent in the report. I just wondered if you could talk me through that cycling activity index and how it's measured, and what the drop means in reality, and if there's any thoughts around what's causing that.
It is really a difficult one, the cycling, because historically the measure was based very much on counting the number of cycles around particular cycle counters, and they were primarily aimed at sort of commuting to some extent. It was cycling going into the city centre and coming out. As we know, what has happened since the pandemic is that people haven't been cycling into the city. You look at the cycle racks at the station, you look at the cycle racks here, the university, there aren't as many bikes as there used to be. But equally, people are buying more bikes than have been in the past. So there's a demand for cycling, and what I think, and as I say, I'm not a transport expert, is there's been a lot more, in inverted commas, leisure cycling going on than there has been on what was historically sort of cycling backwards and forwards. So I know we are looking at how we can better get this data, and I know our business intelligence team are looking at how they can utilise data through Google and through mobile phones, but obviously that only comes through if people are willing to pass their data on to those providers that we can then take advantage of. What we can't really utilise are the old cycle counters that we just had ridden in the street.
I think that trend is right. I mean, I used to cycle to work. I don't cycle to work anymore because I can't cycle down my stairs. But the figures that you see here and the drop in performance that looks like is actually for 2020, which would have been first year of lockdown. We're not getting the 22 figures until, well, we'll have them now, but they're not here. So you're kind of looking in the rearview mirror on this one a bit, but I think that whole pattern of not commuting means you've got less car commuting, but you've also got less cycle commuting.
Thank you. I will. I yeah. I think it will be really interesting to see in next quarter what that data is, because I think we've discussed this before. Because it looks like a particularly bad sort of blip, and perhaps also, and I think we might have mentioned this before as well. It might be useful to get some national comparator on that. Just because it seems as if we are talking about something that is, because the ways of people cycling are changing, then obviously that will be reflected in national comparators, etc. So potentially,
yeah, if I can share, we're very aware that members are particularly interested in this particular indicator and how it's measured. So I do know our transport and business intelligence colleagues are trying to get more to the bottom of it and to understand. But I think it's also right that we've got to acknowledge that we're probably not going back to how we used to have mass commuter cycling like that. I'm obviously getting to an age where I can even remember when I used to live in Acomb, how the numbers of bikes used to pile out of the carriage works and so on and so forth. It was like a swarm at 4 o'clock or whatever time they were coming out. We're probably not going to go back to those days, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what the council's doing in encouraging cycling isn't actually being successful, but it's just a different way of travelling than what we historically did.
Yeah, I appreciate it. We've also discussed exactly this data because it's not changed from quarter to quarter for some time in previous scrutiny. So I would, if we could move on from that in a bit, then that would be good. But Councillor Douglas.
Can I just support what you said about getting national comparators though, because some of it does seem counterintuitive. If people are not going on buses but they're driving, you would think that if they're not going on buses they might cycle as well. So some of it does seem a bit counterintuitive, but I think to have some data from other parts of the country would be really useful, and it would satisfy us to a great extent.
2020 nobody was going anywhere, were they really? So,
yeah. Actually they were, because they were going out leisure cycling. They're going out for an hour's exercise on their bike, and people were buying bikes in droves, as somebody said.
Yeah, as I say, we've talked about this a lot previously, so if we move on, that would be good, but I appreciate it. Thank you for that, Councillor Taylor. Councillor Douglas.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a couple of questions about the analysis finance on page 9 and page 10. And significant variances. One is the development management, and so that is a net income line for us, and the income there actually in reality is 50% below what we would have expected. I'm just wondering why, given that there was a gap in the ability of developers and residents to actually do anything on the planning terms, and then now, of course, everybody is trying to get things built left, right and centre. And then also on economic development, there's an underspend there of 122,000, and I'm just wondering why that is there, where that's come from, given that the structure of that department has changed recently, absorbing inward investment from Make It York and its growing importance in the city and remit within the council as well. If you have any info, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, the budget line that's shown in here is the net budget. So something like development management, it is broadly funded by fees. There's some supporting parts of development management, which is in the business support, which is reported in a different directorate. So that's where it gets slightly confusing. But we're looking at £2.1 million of expenditure for the team and £2.4 million worth of income for the team. So actually we're down on income, projected income this year of 150,000, which compared to a budget of 2.5 million is sort of just over under 10%. So it's a sort of, about 7.5% down on income. So it's not great, but a lot of the planning income actually comes from major schemes, really big developments. We don't tend to get a lot of income from household conversions and sort of adding in conservatories and so and adding in extra bedroom. The vast majority of the big fees come from the major schemes, and I think it's fair to say that until the local plan to some extent is signed off, there is unlikely to be significant major schemes going through in the very near future. The last ones which we got through were probably council-led delivery in terms of York Central, made quite significant planning fees from that area. So I don't think it's not a huge variation, but it's something we're going to have to keep an eye on. With regard to economic development, yes, during August, I think it was, we brought in the inward investment team, but when we brought in the inward investment team, there were also vacancies within that team. So we have had an underspend because we have not been in a position to fill those vacancies within economic development.
I'll let you come back in.
So how many vacant spaces are there in that team? 122,000 is quite a lot, I would have, well, you know, it's a reasonable number FTE.
How many people are in the team?
And how many people are in the team?
A team of about 10, I believe.
Not big, it's not as big as that. There's about 7 members of staff. We've got 2.5 vacancies at the moment. We're out to recruit.
Okay, thank you. I guess it kind of underlines your point made earlier that efficiencies are not necessarily efficiencies when they're not just pen and ink on paper. Councillor Pearson.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I'm just looking at the table on page 24, and I noticed it's measure CAN 029, percentage of ultra low emission vehicles in City of York Council fleet operating in York, brackets electric and hybrid. And I've noticed that that's gone down. So I'm just wondering what the reason for that measure going down might be.
Yeah, it's a technical adjustment. What we've introduced is CAN 37, which is the percentage of low emission vehicles, electric, hybrid, and Euro 6. Which is shown a 20% increase. So I think the issue with CAN 29 is the numbers in the previous years aren't equivalent to the numbers that are now being quoted. So I think there's an error, not an error, but it's not comparable, the numbers on the left as they are on the right. It is now been introduced because we are actually bringing in purely electric vehicles, that they wanted an indicator that looked at purely electric vehicles, but the numbers on the left are not what we had, aren't what we were classing as purely electric. I'm not sure if I explained that particularly well. I know we are currently in likely to arrive in the next week or two of 60 to 70 electric vans which are going into our building services fleet. There has been, we ordered these vehicles as a significant amount of time, but due to delays with not only semiconductors, but the whole backlog of bringing in new vehicles has meant that they haven't come online as quickly as we would have hoped, but they are now coming forward. And so we're actually starting to see a significant increase in our electric fleet, which is along the aspirations of the council.
Thank you. Is yours subsidiary to this, or Councillor Douglas then, and I'll come to you.
Thanks. So is there any financial implication or arrangement around the waste trucks, the electric waste trucks that have had to go back to manufacturer and have been taken out of the fleet at this point?
My understanding is that we are having conversations with the supplier around whether the repairs are under the warranty. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able, that the manufacturer will repair them at their own cost, but I'm not involved directly in those conversations.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Councillor Hunter.
Mine's regarding the figures on the fly tipping. I mean, it's always a bane of our lives nationally and in our wards, and it's great to see that the figures have gone down for a change. Is that any particular reason? Is that due to any enforcement or fines? Or is it just less reporting in from councillors?
I don't have any background onto that. I can get an officer to get back to you though.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions, comments, queries? No, very well. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Patrick and Tracy, and for that finance monitor part. We come to item 6 on the agenda, the work plan, which is for 2022-23 municipal year. So I don't know if anybody wants to start us off on any suggestions for topics, conversations, future meetings. I think we had kind of a suggestion perhaps earlier that we would like to see the executive member for environment and climate change to discuss something. I don't know if there are any concepts, ideas on what that might be. Oh yes, and sorry, yes, thank you, Angela, for reminding me as well. You will note that we were supposed to at this meeting have a update on Make It York. We've had conversations with them. They unfortunately couldn't make this meeting's date, but they are happy to attend a future date. So I would suggest that we get them in for the next possible meeting. And I'm sure they will be very happy to come along and talk to us then. That seems appropriate to me. I believe it was a board meeting of some description today, wasn't it? So, so the 26th of July meeting, which is the next suggested meeting, they are available. So I would suggest that we put them in there. Councillor Daubney.
Can I suggest that it would be useful to meet with the York bid, since they are now on their second 5-year term, and can talk about their perspectives for coming 5-year period, their plans for the centre, their services for their members.
I think that seems so. Councillor Douglas.
And I think by that time as well, should be in a position to bring the bus elements of the city together and update us on what's going on with that and the bus improvement plan. And also we wanted to look at the health of the bus, the firms running the services, and making sure that we maintain healthy bus services for the people of York, because I understand the pressures are really quite high at the moment.
Yeah, I appreciate we'd had conversations about making sure that was discussed, and updating is on the bus improvement plan. I'm not sure they're quite at a place where they're happy to talk, but I think they shall be very, very shortly. So I think that does make sense. I guess the question is, those are 3 quite weighty and meaty items. I would perhaps suggest that we don't put them all in one agenda, unless we want to still be here some hours after it starts. So perhaps, I don't know what members feel and think, but maybe we could see what dates York bid could make, as we will be inviting them externally, and therefore work on that basis, but potentially try and fit the bus plan in first, because that seems to me, then will we not having 2 external organisations, quasi-external organisations in at the same time, which I think is perhaps sensible, unless there's thought on that. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you. I don't have any strong views as to who we should have on which days. I do think we should try and get the exec member in as soon as possible. I would also like to suggest a new topic, which I've discussed with you, George, via email. The council has a policy about charging of electric vehicles, and this is predominantly based on charging at sites and very little focus on charging at home. And yet the technology is changing. There are technological solutions to this, and I think it would be appropriate for this committee to look at those means of charging electric vehicles at home, perhaps particularly in streets where there aren't driveways and garages where people can easily plug in a vehicle, and see if the policy needs to be modified for the future. So I'd very much like the committee to look at that. It perhaps isn't an urgent matter for the 26th of July, but we can ask the officers whether somebody could bring a report to the committee, and then we discuss what we want to do about it.
Yeah, I don't know what the view is of officers. My initial feeling would be that maybe they would like more time than that in July, although it's not quite a reasonable length.
There was a policy went to executive probably just before the pandemic, wasn't there, where these issues were considered.
There is a policy.
Yeah, and so it is a relatively
I think if the issue is presenting the existing policy and having a discussion about it, there's not loads of work involved in that.
So it's a case of whether you think it's an urgent matter or whether we need to press ahead with some of these other things which have been discussed, I think, Chair.
Thank you. I think we should have a conversation about officer capacity potentially with the relevant officer who isn't here, so I don't want to jump some work on him without his view, and then perhaps myself and the vice chair can discuss whether we put that in then or whether we're happy to sort of delay it to a future.
I'm cool with that, thank you.
I've got hands. Councillor Pearson was up first, so we'll go to him and then Councillor Grace.
Thanks, Chair. It was just to supplement what Councillor Taylor was just saying, really. I totally get what you're saying about the residential aspect. I think it would also be good to understand a little bit about what's been done so far. I know that the hyperhub has definitely been built at Vanguard or near the shop, the new shops. So I'd like to understand what's going on there and how it's being used to date. But then the other thing is how the council works with local businesses and organisations to get more infrastructure in place. Because certainly something that residents ask me is when are the co-op or when are Sainsbury's going to put in stuff near the shops. So yeah, alongside the residential stuff, I'd quite like an update. And
sounds like mission creep, but I'm not at all concerned about that, Chair. I think that would be okay. I mean, personally, I'd like to see another hyper hub on a multi-storey car park on St George's Fields. But there you go.
Councillor Douglas?
Yeah, just on that subject, so the other thing that I think would be interesting to know about is how other similarly sized cities are performing in this respect, because it really was marked to me recently. I went away for a week from York that I hadn't done in some time, and it was marked the number of electric vehicles that were moving around in the area I was in, because it was obvious that there was a lot of on-street charging available. And in York, I think we still have relatively low numbers. So I think it would be helpful to have some comparative data so that we can understand where we sit compared to others as well.
I think that's all good stuff. My comment would be, I think that we're talking about quite a substantial body of work potentially. So maybe we'd be looking at a meeting after then, although I wouldn't want to speak for the officer involved, but it seems to me that if we want to look at this in a holistic sense, which I think is a good idea, yeah, perhaps some more work needs to be done before we discuss that, Councillor Douglas.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the agenda that we had for this meeting, and I'm wondering if our July meeting needs to be pretty close to a rerun of what we were expecting to do today, other than the finance monitor, which obviously we've covered the other two have been essentially deferred.
Yeah, I'd support that.
I think potentially that might be a sensible direction forwards, but we have also had raised the bus system and yeah, no, there was another one. Yes, and yes. So my suggestion would be that we aim for a similar agenda as to this one, with obviously the addition of what was initially discussed, i.e. make it York coming along, and then we just potentially have a third agenda item, which I'm loath to do, but I think we could just about manage it. That would be either York bid update or bus system update. Does that sound sensible? And I would perhaps base that on the basis of when York bid can attend easily, rather than setting it in stone and falling flat because they can't make it. Does that seem wise to all? Okay, excellent. Well, if that's okay, we don't have any urgent business, so I would suggest that we end the meeting there. Thank you very much to officers and members for contributions and everything else.